So we are starting our last session of the day here in the room, operations track, artificial intelligence, an opportunity for the military or more of the threat. The moderator of the panel is Gabriel Jacobson. Dr. Gabriel Jacobson is Chief Scientist at CyberGem Consulting, a firm specializing in the development of cognitive situation awareness and control situations for government and business applications. Gabriel is author of over 120 technical publications in expert systems, intelligent databases, real-time event correlations, cyber attack, resilient systems, and cognitive situation control. I mean, the bio of Gabriel is definitely longer, but we need to start the panel. So please, Gabriel.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you. And first of all, I'm really happy to be back in my hometown, in my alma mater. It's always great to meet you here, and I feel myself like CCDCOE was my second home in Tallinn. So I hope you will enjoy today's session. And the title is very intriguing. You know, what is good and what is bad, hopefully no bad, using AI in our life, and particularly in military operations. So we have a great team here. First, right from me is Joe Barton, and he will talk together with Simona Soer, and they share the time together. And the second presentation is Lieutenant Colonel Niels de Verdiesen from Dutch Armed Forces, and the final speaker is Raim Lee. Rain Leevoja. So he's also Estonian, but lives now in New Zealand. So let me just give you few words as an introduction to warm it up. Everybody knows that the battlefield nowadays is very little common with a kinetic battlefield in the World War II. You know, telling the truth, the modern battle, which is asymmetric, which is a really resilient, self-organizing, very digitized, is actually to large extent won before the battle starts. So the second important aspect, that since AI was created almost 60 years ago, there are many, and luckily I was witnessing almost all AI high days and winters. And I can tell you that probably from the technology point of view, AI nowadays is not only evolutionary event or revolutionary, but we can see that AI is becoming a disruptive technology, which actually changes the business model, how we handle different aspects of our life. So the question is, what are the benefits? What are the things that we can get from AI? Even more fundamental, do we understand what is AI? And some people say, come on, 60 years AI and you are still talking what is AI? I think AI, as some people are telling, is like a firebird. If you catch it, the AI, and open, this is just regular programming. We need to do something else. And always when we get some next level of AI, it is programming. So AI is like a firebird. But at the same time, AI is like a double-faced feature. From one hand, we get a lot of benefit, but we have to be cautious that it is not hurting us. And what happens if the AI technology comes in the hands of our adversaries? So shortly, we need to know what is the role and place in modern warfare. not talking about our modern day activities. But we concentrate in our session in the modern military operations, whatever they will be in the space, in the ocean, in the land, in the sea. And what are the impacts, how we can challenge these impacts, how we can make benefit of them. And finally, the third point, we judge about the value of AI in our society, in our life, not only in terms and notions of technical, but believe it or not, we are limited, constrained, checked, and verified by our social capabilities, our social aspects of our life, our legal aspects of our life, our cultural aspects of our life. So things are becoming, as people say, multidisciplinary. So on that note, I will stop my beginning because my wife is always telling me, Gabe, you are talking too much. So our first presentation comes from New Zealand and from Belgium. And the title of the presentation is Understanding the Strategic Implications of Weaponization of Artificial Intelligence. And presentation is given by Joe Borton. And Joe is a senior, you can stand up, senior lecturer at New Zealand Institute of Security and Crime Scene Analysis from University of Waikato. And of course, his research focuses on cybersecurity, NATO, and the impact of science and technology on international security. And Joe holds a doctorate on international relations. So, and second person together giving this lecture is Simona Soar from Belgium, and she is from the Institute of European Studies at University of St. Louis in Brussels. And previously, she served as a researcher with the Romanian Minister of Defense and was US Defense Fellow. And her interest is in exploring the impact of AI, advanced robotics, and automation in military capabilities. So, Joe and Soar, floor is yours, please.
Okay, we'll just head
and don't
over
remember, you have 20 minutes.
We'll try and stick to it. Kia ora koutou, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and a real honor to be here, actually. This is our first time presenting at CyCon and being part of the book project as well. It's a tremendous honor to be amongst such esteemed scholars and colleagues. And I want to emphasize from the outset that we approach this subject with a good deal of humility. Simona and myself are fairly new researchers in the area of AI specifically. And the purpose really of our paper today is probably to pose more questions than to answer questions and have a debate about what we think are the strategic implications of the weaponization of AI. And we're very much here to learn from you as well as presenting our paper. So thanks very much for having us. I thought I'd start off today just by providing a little bit of context for the debate. You've, I'm sure, heard of the term killer robots. If you've been listening to the news in recent years, we've had this sort of global concern over lethal autonomous weapons systems and the integration of AI into weapons platforms. And coming as I do all the way from New Zealand, even a small country at the edge of the South Pacific, we've had these debates permeating New Zealand culture and campaigns set up to stop killer robots in New Zealand. I think probably robots are probably more likely to be used in New Zealand for avocado picking and sheep herding rather than counterinsurgency or counter-terrorism. Nonetheless, the debate has permeated as far as that. We've also seen very much an increased policy focus in relating to AI in recent years. I was reading just in the news yesterday, Estonia, I think, has just announced another 2-year AI strategy. We've had the release of the DoD AI strategy in 2019, an EU strategy, mainly economy and civilian focus, released in 2018. And many countries, including some of the NATO countries, are releasing national AI strategies. So part of what we're doing is looking at those and extrapolating some of the implications of this area. This is obviously very much closely related to cybersecurity as well. We've had a lot of discussion in cybersecurity debates about the efficacy of AI and how AI technologies might be used to enhance cybersecurity. And increasingly, researchers now looking at perhaps the more negative offensive uses of AI. And again, Gabriel's talked about this double-edged sword, if you like, and that's very much applies to this area. As Gabriel said, the literature on AI goes back, obviously, some decades, but I still think in the security and strategic studies area particularly, which is the area Simona and I work in, the literature is really still embryonic. There was a journal article in Journal of Strategic Studies last year, which is one of the top journals in the field, and this, according to the author, was the first real strategy treatment of AI in that journal. So it's quite actually a new topic of focus within security and strategic studies, and it's in that context that we wanted to write a paper on it, even though we're quite new to the subject ourselves. So I just want to talk you through a little bit about what are the basic parameters of the paper, what we're trying to achieve. I hope you've had a chance to have a look at it in the book. The basic question we're asking is, what is the likely strategic implications of the weaponization of AI? I'll talk about what we mean by weaponization in a second. I realize it's a controversial term in itself. And really the purpose of what we're trying to do is to enhance understanding of the different aspects of what policymakers and military officials will face as AI technologies are integrated into war and conflict. Again, I'd emphasize this is exploratory initial research on our part. It's quite big picture. And the basic argument that we pose in the paper is that relates to this idea as to whether AI is evolutionary or revolutionary, and there seems to be a bit of a binary argument in the literature about that at the moment. And our response to that is that really the role of AI will differ across military tasks. It might revolutionize some tasks, such as logistics, maintenance, but will probably be more evolutionary for others, particularly when it comes to things like life and death decision-making. One of the primary things that we needed to do in writing the paper was to try and maybe establish a tentative typology of artificial intelligence. And we're all aware of AI applications, voice recognition attached to our phones, but we wanted to spend some time trying to map out what are some of the core distinctions, and this is what we spend some time doing in the first section of the paper. So we first make a distinction between practical AI and fundamental AI. And here, practical AI refers to technological development and the computing requirements associated with technical progress. Whereas more in our area, really, fundamental AI is about the social, economic, psychological, philosophical, and political implications of AI use. And one of the things that we've observed happen, and which is mentioned in the literature, is there's increasingly a gap between the two. So we've actually made quite a lot of progress technically in AI in recent years, but maybe the sort of philosophy and the political science and the thinking around AI hasn't actually caught up. This was quite well framed by Henry Kissinger, who said that we are in the presence of a potentially dominating technology, but still in search of a guiding philosophy for that technology. So that's the first distinction, practical AI and fundamental AI. We also have come across the distinction between narrow AI and general AI. Now, narrow AI is the most common type of AI already in civilian and military use. And this refers really to a technology that can perform a single task at a time. The task it's been specifically built to perform, and it doesn't necessarily have the ability to migrate the knowledge or behaviors it's taught or has learned in one context to other situations. That's to be contrasted with general AI, which is not, as far as we're aware, yet deployed either in the civilian or the military realms. And this type of AI really has the ability to understand context, to successfully apply information behaviors learned in one context to other situations, to actually adjust its behavior depending on the context. And in its most sophisticated form, general AI may become self-aware. And this is the field of AI that's often referred to as artificial consciousness, machine consciousness, synthetic consciousness, or even singularity. Again, we're not at that level of technology yet. And if you can see on the slide, these areas are in white. Really, the types of AI that we're dealing with at the moment are in the blue here. Forms of narrow AI can be reactive, and then they're not capable of forming memories or using past interaction to shape decisions, or they might have limited memories in that they might process simple pieces of past information, but are not capable of using that information to influence anything or to make decisions per se. We also make a distinction in the paper between software and hardware. I mean, ultimately, AI is software. It's an algorithm or a set of algorithms. But what we're seeing more commonly is that software integrated into various hardware and obviously integrated into military platforms in the security sphere. Again, this is not an exhaustive typology. This is really, again, just an initial attempt to map out some of the key distinctions and provide a platform for maybe subsequent and future research in this area. Ultimately, our concern is about the weaponization of AI. And I just want to talk about that briefly. What we mean by that in the paper essentially is the use, firstly, the use and integration of AI technology into weapons systems and platforms across really the 4 domains of warfare for strategic advantage. So really that's our first conception of AI weaponization. The second one refers really to the use of AI as more of a standalone capability to undermine, disrupt, defeat, and destroy adversary systems through computer network-enabled operations. So this is AI essentially being weaponized within the 5th domain, if you like. Again, we're aware that the concept of weaponization within the cybersecurity area is controversial. I was looking at a tweet the other day from Thomas Rid, who was taking people to task for referring to cyber weapons. And we appreciate the term that we use in IR is securitizing discourse, that we're creating a process of securitization by using this language. But if you look at the previous literatures on weaponization, there are some commonalities here. And essentially, we're talking about civilian or dual-use technologies being adapted for military purposes and used with the intent to cause harm. And that's the key distinction. So obviously, we've talked about weaponization in outer space, putting weapons in Earth's orbit. We've talked about the weaponization of biological agents or chemical agents or radiological ones. Much of the debate in recent years has been about the weaponization of information. We're wary of maybe the pitfalls of describing it like that. But ultimately, if AI is used with the intent to cause harm or damage, either through computer networks or as part of being integrated into weapons systems, we think that that's a reasonably accurate characterization of maybe what's happening. So let me just talk briefly about the first area that we go into in the paper, which is the weaponization of AI in cyberspace. And obviously, there's been a lot of research done on the utility of AI for cyber defense. This is summed up quite nicely here by Vasaduvian. Today's systems generate so much security data that human experts are rapidly surpassed. People cannot find the attack elements fast enough or reliably enough. By comparison, computers excel at these operations. AI can help make sense of what they find, can even help by offering suggestions to security teams of processes to handle them. And of course, the utility of AI in cyber defense is, I think, growing as the technology grows. We heard yesterday the Internet of Things might be 50 billion devices by the middle of the 2020s. As the networks expand, as the size of the networks expand, AI will probably come into its use. But really what we look at in the paper is the more offensive elements of AI weaponization. And we recognize, as others have done, that hackers are already developing tools to manipulate AI and turn it against its controller or user. That AI may be fooled into seeing things that are not there, misclassifying objects and processes, failing to identify patterns or processes within data that has become corrupted or corruptible. We've seen advances in AI that make the malware itself more damaging. One recent example, this was an IBM research project around the Deep Locker malware. This was an AI-enabled malware that was able to deliver the WannaCry virus through video conferencing applications and on the basis of it harvesting social media information. So really quite sophisticated attack methods and vectors. And as the research by the organization Control Risk suggests, we're seeing increasingly sophisticated range of AI-enabled cyber attack capabilities, such as spear phishing campaigns that harness big data, hive nets, extensive tailored attacks, and advanced obfuscation techniques. And arguably, these AI-enabled cyber capabilities are, again, increasing malicious actors' ability to cause harm and with intent. I'm going to pass over now to my co-author, Simona, who's going to come up and talk about the next two sections of the paper, if you like, which is more about sort of weaponization in the military context, and then I'll conclude shortly after that.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here, for interest in our research. Let me just say, pick up where Joe left off, and pick up from what Gabriel was saying earlier about the evolutionary and revolutionary sort of binary way of looking at the employment of AI in the security and defense field. What it occurred to us when we were working on the paper was that most of the literature that we looked at, whether in academia per se or in the think tank community, was placing the use of AI in security and defense in a binary, sort of in two baskets, either revolutionary and how it was revolutionizing warfare and changing the nature of warfare, or that it was more evolutionary, it was going to be slow, there are going to be so many similarities with other technologies. Of course, we're not reinventing all wheels all the time. But what it occurred to us is if we look at more mundane issues around adoption and use, around standards, of course, around the idea of a doctrine of actual employment, about the actors and the scale and sectors, then perhaps it's useful to look at it on a spectrum of evolutionary to revolutionary, rather than put them into separate baskets. And I'll just take a very few minutes to talk about, for instance, adoption. This is, of course, a field where we have lower barriers for entry in general, depending on the complexity of the technology we're talking about here. But the playing field is not level altogether. Things like organizational capacity, organizational culture, the flexibility of those institutional frameworks to integrate rapidly new technologies is not a given. It's not the same for every actor out there. The issues around standardization, development of standards related to the use of AI, for instance, or how we built AI technologies or AI-enabled capabilities is not the same across the spectrum. So we're seeing a slowly emerging consensus, for instance, in the CCW that humans need to be in the loop. So that's a huge step forward, especially if we're talking at the decision level, at the decision-making level, excuse me, or if we're talking at about life and death situations. But everything below that, that's just a gray area. The United States has announced that it wants to position itself to influence the development of these norms and rules, but ultimately we're still to see those coming. The European Union came out with an ethical guideline for the development of the safe development and use of AI, and that's gaining some traction, I think, in Europe, but not worldwide, and there are aspects of it that would be contested by other countries. So we're not quite there yet, and there are increasing concerns that we're just sort of engaged in a race to the bottom in this sense. Then the other issue is about how we're actually employing AI, and I appreciate that AI is unique. And so was cyber beforehand. But think about how long it took us in the process that it took us to distill exactly how we're using AI. And we're still thinking about it now, and this conference just is an example of how we're still reflecting on that. So in a sense, an evolutionary path is there implicitly. The third thing is actors. It's not going to, the deployment of AI-enabled capabilities is not going to have the same impact on a great power as it will on the smaller actors. There are great debates now that are going on in academia, for instance, about the power diffusion towards smaller states and how they and non-state actors are going to be able to punch well above their weight by using these kind of force enhancement capabilities. And then last but not least, it's also about the sectoral use. Not everyone has the same scale, and not everyone has envisions full spectrum capabilities. For instance, China and Russia and the United States, maybe they're thinking a little bit more in full spectrum perspective, but other countries, including European ones, are perhaps thinking of more niche capabilities, niche roles, niche sectors in which to deploy AI capabilities. Now, generally, we looked at some two dozen strategies, national strategies so far, and there are a number of elements. There's great commonality on roles. So there's great consensus there on what we can do with AI. And of course, the main focus in all of these is that it improves situational awareness, it helps us thus enhance decision-making at political as well as military levels of action. It, of course, enhances our logistics and maintenance cycles with direct operational impact on deployability, on readiness. It enhances mission precision. It enhances military effect. Excuse me, through a number of ways. It also acts as force protection. It enables us to deploy, for instance, in conjunction with robotics, systems that will take over dangerous jobs, or jobs that are simply dull, or that will keep our forces out of harm's way and enhance their ability to operate at a safe range and reduce casualties. But what we're not necessarily seeing in any of these strategies reflected in depth is the political context. Of course, they're all thinking, they're all considering the strategic context, the strategic environment, but what we're seeing is very little reflection on the political side of it. I come from a policy background as well as an academic one, so I appreciate the importance, and perhaps this is the uniqueness or the unique challenge that AI poses, the fact that through non-human agency, as it were, we're actually reaching a threshold where we're starting to challenge some assumptions about the political power relations, right, at national and international level, issues about responsibility and accountability in ethical and legal ways. And this is something that I think it boils down to what was said, I think, yesterday, right here. There are some concerns, for instance, that regime type might predispose some countries to an advantage in the employment of AI because of more relaxed standards, because of more relaxed legislation or ethical guidelines, rather than democratic regimes, which really feel the weight of the legal and ethical infrastructure we already have. The other aspect of it, in terms of the political background, I would say, is the fact that these capabilities will not, just like many other capabilities, will not operate in a strategic and political vacuum. And there, I think that not enough consideration has been given on issues of deterrence, on issues of crisis stability, on issues of management of escalation. We're yet to see those. Two final points, very, very quick ones. We're seeing elements across all these strategies of either attrition, disruption, as Gabe was referring to earlier, or destruction. But it's not very clear whether these play into each other or whether they're separate and we're going to prioritize one or the other. So that's something that's very important with all aspects of military success. And last thing is all of them, or most, well, no, all of them focus on human-machine teaming and just generally are human-centric. But there's very little reflection on the issue of control, especially on political control and the recognition, ultimately, that humans are just going to be outpaced and unable to fully control all of these capabilities at all times of their operation. Two last things. We're not very sure in terms of human-machine teaming whether we're all the time on an interoperability or on an integration spectrum. And what's even less clear is whether we're going to use it as a plan A or as a plan B in a purely supportive role, or how exactly that will materialize in the battlefield. I'll just pass it on to Joe now for a few conclusions, and thank you, and I'm sorry for taking way too long.
Thank you. Just a very quick wrap-up. Trying to distill the strategic implications. What are they going to be? Well, I think AI, the adoption of AI is going to be very widespread across both state and non-state actors. It's going to be largely covert or invisible. It's a silent battle in many ways. It's going to increase speed, it's going to increase lethality, and it's going to, of course, be very adaptive to its own situation and environment. Obviously, there's a requirement for military-civilian fusion and cooperation in this area. That's kind of a tautology that applies across cybersecurity. Elsa Kanya has done some really great work on this in respect of Chinese development of AI. Does China have an advantage because of that closer relationship between the state and the private sector? This, I think, will be key. Ultimately, we think AI will increase situational awareness, but that won't go so far as to really lift the fog of war. There'll still be a lot of uncertainty around opposition intentions. We do believe that it's going to be evolutionary for the most part, and we're going to continue to see a transformation in armed conflict and a transition probably from more information warfare models to intelligent warfare models. And again, one of the core points we're trying to get across is really believe that this debate about killer robots sort of misses the point, really, in some ways. It's not just about humans being completely out of the loop all the time. Weaponization processes are already happening. We think the human involvement would differ across military tasks. So we're not going to delegate nuclear weapons to machines. We might do so for logistics. So there's really a scale of human involvement depending on the military function. Again, we apologize for taking up too much time. Hopefully there's still plenty of time for our other presenters. Thank you for your patience, and we're keen to hear some questions as well at some point. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Yeah, please. Can you bring the microphone here, the fourth row?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your both presentations. You mentioned that in the battlefield, AI will improve situation awareness. Is it possible to provide some practical examples of this improvement in situation awareness? Thank you.
It's not something that we included in the paper, but I think if you look at the sorts of sensor systems that are being integrated into infantry, for example, we will be receiving more and more information from electronic devices that are essentially being carried around by our armed forces, so we can get a more accurate picture of what's happening to them individually in the battlefield context. You know, heart rate monitors, GPS, situation awareness of where individual people are or troops are on the battlefield. That we're generating a lot of data about that in real time. So that might be one significant example. In the maritime domain, I think that there's from New Zealand perspective, we're looking at incorporating AI into naval platforms. For example, it's being used in training for engineers on military platforms and to gain increased situational awareness in maritime missions that we're being deployed to in whether Operation Ocean Shield off Africa, for example, sending frigates there. So I think that the connections that can be made between armed forces in very dispersed, large conflict arenas will be considerably enhanced. I can't be any more specific than that. Simona, do you have any more specific examples?
I was thinking that, for instance, the STO has 200-something projects, and most of them are in this area of how to enhance different bits of our ability to project a common and coherent picture of what's going on around us. But I think that, and this is one area where it's perfect to show not just the added value of AI, but how it needs to work seamlessly. And I'm very glad you asked that question, because I didn't make the point in the presentation. But I think that it needs to work seamlessly with other technologies. And when I was referring to, this is a field with a lower barrier for entry, sure, writing algorithms might be lower barrier, but integrating it with sensors and then integrated it on military platforms, seeing from space, all of this is so complex that the barrier for entry might not be so small for states that want to do all of that. So in terms of situational awareness, I think that there's masses of potential to link every single type of data that comes our way from different sources, analyze it in real time or almost in real time to project a as close as possible trajectory of how things are around us. And I think that that's where a lot of the projects that I've looked at. Obviously, I'm from outside the system, so I don't have access to it. I have only open source information. But whatever is open out there, it focuses on that.
And cyber situational awareness, I think, is important as well. Awareness of what's happening in very large computer networks. I think there's increased work going into that direction too.
I can just steal from the audience 15 seconds. Situational awareness is probably one of the most successful areas comparing, for example, in the decision making. If you are familiar with the work with Micah Hensley, she was a chief scientist at Air Force. So this is a greatest area. Maybe you have heard about the DARPA program on smart dusk, where the sensors are fertilized from plane. And it was a very interesting project. Unfortunately, it didn't go too much because each sensor, micro sensor, which was dropped from the sky, didn't have IP address, so there was a quite communication problem. But I see there was a hand for the more question.
Ladies, gentlemen, I'm Cadet Chloe Tran from the United States Military Academy. Do you think AI can be effectively employed below the threshold of armed conflict, or do you think it would escalate above the threshold with its use?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting, and it reflects the fact that we ultimately don't know yet. This is the point that I was trying to get at in the presentation, that we know how it can help us now, but we really have no idea of where that would leave us on the spectrum of, we were talking about deterrence earlier today and yesterday. We're talking about the negative impact on crisis stability and on escalation. Where would that place us? And would it be strictly something that will remain in the virtual domain, or will it translate with swarms, for instance? Will it translate more into the kinetic field? So there's not a lot of non-technical literature that I've seen on that.
Can I just also say, I mean, one of the primary examples in recent years is essentially the use of AI below the threshold of armed conflicts, which is really the sort of algorithmic manipulation of social media, if you like. So I think AI can be used as part of information operations, And we've seen that in recent years. And again, we talked about the role of AI in things like logistics and maintenance and training. So I think that it has important functions in those areas. Is not always going to be about facilitating, war fighting necessarily. So yes, I think it can exist below the threshold of armed conflict.
Okay, thank you very much again. And our second speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Ilse Verdiesen from the Dutch Armed Forces, but most importantly, she is a PhD student and makes research on a very important topic about how humans can oversight or communicate with artificial intelligent agents. So, Ilse, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Joe and Simone, for setting the scene for my talk. I will be mostly showing you practical examples of the type of classifications that Joe and Simone mentioned. In my day job, I'm an army officer. I work at the Innovation Center at the Defense Staff of the Dutch MOD. And I'm trying to conduct a PhD part-time on the design of human oversight of autonomous weapon systems. So it's customary in research to start with a classification of your own. So as you can see, I took the model of Professor van den Berg, who is a cybersecurity researcher in the Netherlands, and he designed a model to show that we often tend to look at technology, but we forget other things like activities that we do with the technology and the governance of it. So in this model, I put AI technologies, such as algorithms and machine learning, at the center. It's the technology layer, but I'm also looking in my research towards the activities that we do with it, technology, because we want to use AI in our military operations. And in order to do so, we also have to consider the social technical layer, as we call that at the university, and see what do those activities bring for us humans, and what do we humans can do with that technology itself. But more importantly, we need to figure out, and that's the debate that has been going on for about 5 years now, how do we govern those activities? If we talk about control and accountability and oversight, those are all governing activities that I placed at the outer layer of my model. You look at institutions like the UN, who is guiding the talks on lethal autonomous weapon systems. You also look at organizations such as NATO, or the roles as a force commander who actually deploy weapons. So it's the whole system that you have to take a look at, and not just AI itself. And I also try to show in this model that you also have AI systems across all domains. It is a cyber conference, so you can see AI application in the cyber domain, but it's also in air or land, and these are just examples to make it a little bit more tangible. And of course, navigation, you have it at sea, you have it in the air, and you have it at land. The focus of my research is autonomous weapon systems. That's really where the core of the debate is about. A lot of people have strong opinions and views on autonomous weapon systems. It's in basis, you can define an autonomous weapon as a weapon system with AI, but in the debate, people have trying to figure out what is an autonomous weapon system. It's often mentioned that it's without human intervention, it selects and engages targets. Those are the critical functions, often referred to as the critical functions. But what I think is very important to stress is it's always based on predefined criteria. A weapon does not take off or drive off and take targets based on a list that it devises itself. We as humans have a very big role. We always make human decisions to deploy a weapon, and also to predefine criteria towards that weapon is deployed and conducts an attack. But an important part of this is that once you launch it, you cannot stop it anymore. But that's not custom for only autonomous weapons, it's also for missiles, which I will show later on. I've added some concrete examples, like the Taranis UAV. The Ural 9, that's a Russian tank that's been used in Syria. It wasn't very successful. You can say, okay, it was a failure. On the other hand, it also shows that the Russians are working and using it and learning from these systems in a military environment. And the Sea Hunter is a US Navy ship that's being tested, or at least it was 2 years ago. So the question is often raised, well, is it new? Are these systems a novelty? Actually, they're not. There have been automated systems for about 20, 25 years now. You can question, is it artificial intelligence or is it just automation? That's an academic discussion. But both the Goalkeeper and the Patriot air defense system that I'm showing can be used in a fully automated setting without humans in the loop, without human control. In the Dutch Ministry of Defense, we always use human decision-making before releasing a target, but they can be set to fully automatic. So if we look at a few current examples, then we're looking at, for example, unmanned ground vehicles. These are two types that we're using in the Netherlands. We're testing them to see how would they fit in our military operations, what would we have to change in our TTPs, in our SOPs, how can we learn from these types of systems. They're mainly used now for logistic operations. They can, for example, be used to keep our personnel safe in the last mile towards the supply line, which is the most dangerous. And being a logistic officer by trade, I think they can have a lot of benefits there. But there are also other applications which you could think of. These can be used remote control, so an operator following the vehicle and steering it, but they can also be programmed to follow an automated path. Or follow a human with sort of LiDAR systems, and it can be integrated in a team concept. So I have a picture of that later on. We also see a lot of swarming. This is a clip of a CBS 60 Minutes video, which was, I think they looked at how DARPA was conducting autonomous systems, or was working with autonomous systems, and these all dots are little swarms that have been ejected from an F-18, and these swarms converge toward a target. They got several targets. They were tasked with different targets that they had to follow. You see a road going up, and you see a vehicle, and all those swarms, 100 of them, converge to that point. This has been done 2 years ago, so not really recent, but it's already there. If you look at other types of current applications, this is a Chinese above water unmanned sea vessel or surface vessel that's been used. Singapore also has these type of vessels, because if you look at the South Pacific, there's a huge ocean space that they want to cover, and these type of systems can have a lot of benefits. You need less personnel, you can cover more areas. You can conduct more military operations, you can survey more parts of the sea. So those are being developed right now. This is a snapshot from a video, you can look it up online. It's about 56 vessels who are swarming and working together on sea. And it's actually, I think, when I look at it, it's quite impressive. And if I start reasoning about it as a military officer, I think, okay, now these are just commercial vessels. What would happen if you put a payload on it, or if you put a weapon on it? How would that affect maritime operations? If we look at near future applications, and Joe already mentioned it, you very often get into the killer robot campaign, ban killer robot campaign imagery, and then you get things like people thinking that future military applications with AI systems is building a killer robot, building a Terminator, but it's actually not what we're doing, at least not in the Netherlands, but this is not what we're thinking about. What are we thinking about? We're looking at object recognition. We're looking at how can we use AI to help our operators in the dull work of going through all the motion videos and trying to find out the deviations of anomalies, or try to spot persons that are actually at an airport having alternative motors than traveling with the plane or trying to pick them out. So you can see this is open source software. It can distinguish a dining table and a cup and a tie and a person. And it would be very nice if it could distinguish a weapon or a type of weapon or people doing something different than we intend them to do. Another example of future application is a more system approach. And I took an example from the sea domain. We just saw the unmanned systems going on the ocean. You can also think, okay, how can we combine surface vessels with underwater vessels in the maritime domain? There are a lot less civilians there, so we can maybe a bit easier apply those types of weapon systems without running into things as the collateral damage or unpredictability. The sea domain is actually quite one of the things I think we'll see it first. I have 2 more slides left with examples. You'll see one of the things you could use these systems is to support us humans in our operations, and I have a little video on it, and I hope it won't start too loud, because it could be that it can be if you're running it. But it actually shows how an F-16 pilot is saved by the use of an autopilot, and I think it's a very nice example to show that these type of systems can actually support us humans.
Kill, recover. 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 Scully, knock it off. Scully 1, knock it off. Scully 2, knock it off. 2, get yourself back above the floor. Scully, knock it off. Scully 1, knock it off. Scully 2, knock it off. Alright, 2, climb back above 12,000. Alright,
So that's just to show that it can actually benefit us. That we can have a lot of opportunities for systems to support us in our military operations. It's not a new example, and autopilot is also not a new example, but there are situations thinkable that we need speed, and a system can actually react faster than we humans can do, especially when you're impaired by too many G-forces. And my last slide on, as an example, is man-machine teaming, already mentioned. We're trying to see how we can use these systems in our operations, how they can help military personnel, how they can carry our load, maybe work with smaller teams. And that, of course, has a lot of implications on training, on doctrine, on our TTPs and how we want to work with it. But it's also a nice application that can help our soldiers in their work. And I'd like to conclude my presentation to talk a little bit about my own research. I'm working on the design of human oversight, and human oversight is very much linked to control. In the debate on autonomous weapon systems, meaningful human control is often mentioned as a requirement. It sounds good, it sounds very positive, we're not quite sure what it means, and scientists and groups like the International Red Cross are trying to figure out what would we mean with control. You can have direct control. Well, the question is, can you have that with autonomous weapon systems? You can have control by setting boundaries before you're starting an operation. We're already doing that, like with rules of engagement that we give to our soldiers, and we're controlling what or way they would or wouldn't do. And you can also have control in hindsight, and that would link to accountability to justify your actions after you took them or deployed a weapon. And if you want to hold people accountable, you need an oversight system to actually to do that. So I tried to give a brief overview in my presentation on all the applicabilities to make it a little bit more tangible and to show that there can be a lot of opportunities, but we really have to be using these systems in a responsible way and think about things as accountability and responsibility beforehand. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time, please. Are there any questions from the audience?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for coming to speak to us. So my question is, since these, we've seen that these artificial intelligence systems, their image recognition software can be spoofed, what safeguards are we placing in these autonomous weapon systems so that false positives aren't resulting in those weapon systems engaging false targets, where obviously the false positive of a weapon system is much more serious than, say, falsely identifying a penguin or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. It was mentioned yesterday in a machine learning track that the current image recognition or the current machine learning software is 99.999% accurate. That still leaves a lot of false positives that can misinterpret situation or images or targets or coordinates. There are actually two things you have to think about, I guess. You have to train your personnel that these things can happen, that you don't have, right now the technology is not good enough to rely 100% on it in your, so you always need human judgment and to think about what am I seeing. The other thing is we should start thinking about counter AI measures. We're talking about counter ID measures, counter UAV measures, but what about counter AI measures? If our opponent starts using these techniques or start using spoofing our software, how will we deal with that? I don't think we have an answer for it right now. Actually, AI systems are not very secure. They're often created in labs by researchers. They're not. I'm always stressing back home, you have to think about security by design principles if you start working with AI systems. But I think we have to have a very long way to go there, and we have to start thinking about it. How can we counter those things? So.
Actually, it's a very important question. You know, we are kind of rushing to use AI technologies, and generally, what innovative technologies. And what we are lacking, or at least we don't do it very well, is how to measure the impact. You know, do we have any matrices? Do you have any kind of even verbal methods to investigate? Yes, for example, we used cognitive information fusion from you know, thousands of sensors attached to human body or spread on the ground. And we do experiments before, without, and after. And can we come up with some kind of metrics, or at least to run some kind of test like you people do in these cyber tests, with cyber attacks, so that we can get at least some kind of preliminary data? Yes, we have impact, but how much impact? So it will be nice in the future when we talk about let's say, AI-based cognitive magnifiers. For example, that was a great example that you showed the video where the autopilot took over the situation in the cockpit. And this happens always. For example, people who are suffering dementia and they need cognitive assistance, which like as physical skeletons which help you to walk, but cognitive assistance which help you to augment your loss of memory or loss of your decision-making power in a fraction of 5 seconds. So this will be quite important task for the future AI use in the battlefield. Any questions more, please? Yes, there is a question in the back.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question that could be divided in 3 parts. Autonomous vehicles, like we all know, if you have a transistor, you can be attacked, or you can have a cyber attack. The problem of, we are talking about autonomous vehicles. These autonomous vehicles or unmanned vehicles have a lot of issues or a lot of things that could be attacked. You talk about the Netherlands policy. I know that if you have autonomous vehicles, how you legally could apply, or you can say that is a weapon, or you can say that is autonomous, how you solve that problem. Another one is these autonomous vehicles are produced by different producers. How the interoperability could affect the AI system, because all of them have different components, and when you apply to AI, you have sense and avoid, but you have another kind of systems that could be difficult to compare. And the end one is when we are talking about human lives, how you solve the weapons, or you can, how could you just justify that you can have a weapon that could have a mistake, and how that could be autonomous, and you only give all the pressure in AI systems. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a good answer right now, but I think especially the systems integration, that's already a challenge right now, and that will only, with AI systems, will only be more extensive. I think we should really focus on when we start buying these systems and integrating it in our military operation. You have to really take good care of the integration. We already have that problem with our IT systems. So it's also not very easy to solve, but you have to really, before you start buying and acquiring systems, think about how you want to integrate those from a system integration perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And our next last speaker is Dr. Rain Liivoja. He is from the Bern School of Law in University of Queensland, and he is also adjunct professor of international law at the University of Helsinki. And his research is on legal challenges associated with military applications and technology. So, Rain, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you this afternoon. My colleagues have given you a perfect strategic, technical and operational context for the remarks that I'm going to make, so I'm grateful to them as well. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk not so much about AI, but of autonomy, which is a related but not entirely overlapping concept, but it is the concept that is being used in the ongoing legal debates in AI in military systems. I am an international lawyer, so I will turn to international law, but just before those of you who are non-lawyers run out of the room, I promise you that I'll make this as painless as possible and talk about the law in very general terms. I am drawing here on a working paper that I've co-authored with Maarja Nagel and Ann Väljataga from the NATO CCDCOE, and with the research assistance of Mihkel Pikat, and I understand that the paper will be published early next week. However, what I say here today represents my personal views, and these might not be shared by my co-authors, by the CCDCOE, or by anyone else for that matter. As a background to the discussion about autonomous cyber capabilities, it's helpful to consider the debates that have been going on about autonomous kinetic systems. And this is an issue that really gained prominence around 2011, 2012, when a series of influential documents was published. The first two were policy documents issued by governments, a UK Ministry of Defence joint doctrine note, which addressed the use of autonomy in unmanned aerial platforms. The second document was a US Department of Defense directive on autonomy in weapon systems. Partly as a reaction to these, there was a publication of two reports dealing with legal issues. The first one by UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, Professor Christoph Heinz. And the second one was issued by Human Rights Watch, a notable human rights advocacy body, jointly with International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. And these latter two reports raised questions about the lawfulness of autonomy in weapon systems under current international law, and they talked about the desirability of either placing a moratorium on increasing autonomy in weapon systems, or better yet, putting in place a ban. And the ethical and legal concerns generally concern systems that would lack direct human oversight in target selection and engagement, which in this context has become referred to as the critical functions of a weapons system. So these concerns are being addressed, as has already been noted, in the context of the group of governmental experts that has been convened under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This is a different group of governmental experts that is dealing with the security issues of ICT. And the group of governmental experts under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons adopted a set of guiding principles last year by consensus, where it outlined broad principles that would apply to autonomy in weapon systems. These principles contained ideas such as that international law applies to all potential developments of autonomous weapons, and that human responsibility in decisions relating to the design and use of autonomous weapon systems has to be maintained. And these principles are being elaborated on further in a series of meetings this year, but the final outcome of this process remains quite unclear at this stage. What is interesting, though, is that cyber capabilities have not really featured particularly prominently in those debates. Those debates have focused quite specifically on kinetic weapon systems. So the US directive that I mentioned earlier on expressly excludes cyber capabilities from its scope. And this is not for any principal reason, but as one of the authors of the US directive, Paul Shari, has explained, the drafters of that document simply deemed autonomy in cyberspace to be too hard to tackle in 2011 when they were looking at this issue. And the group of governmental experts in its meeting has only in passing acknowledged cyber issues, basically by referring to the idea that autonomous weapon systems should have in place appropriate non-physical safeguards, including cybersecurity against hacking. And all of this is slightly odd because it could be argued that Stuxnet, a malware that was designed to cause harm while operating for an extended period of time in an air-gapped system, was in fact the most autonomous weapon system the world has seen so far. Second, the development of autonomous capabilities in kinetic systems will probably for some time lag behind developments in cyber capabilities. And finally, there has been a robust discussion about how international law applies to cyber operations, from which the discussants in the autonomous weapon systems debate could learn a fair bit, but there has been not much of a crossover there. Conversely, those of you working in the cybersecurity space should perhaps also pay attention to what is happening around autonomous weapons. And this is because the articulation of principles that apply to autonomous weapon systems as a matter of international law and the potential future regulation of autonomous weapon systems is likely to also have impact on cyber capabilities, or at least some of them. So depending on how autonomous weapon systems will be defined, and we don't really have a good definition as yet, they might at least start covering those cyber operations that are capable of causing physical harm. overall, I would say that the debate on autonomous weapon systems and international law is about 5 to 10 years behind the debate on international law and cyber operations. Part of the reason I submit to you is that there has been no Tallinn manual-like process and no series of CyCons to deal those issues in a very granular form. The discussions that are ongoing in the group of governmental experts on the moment are held in a very high-level politicized manner and on the background of the campaign to ban killer robots, which doesn't often allow for a very particularly detailed discussions. Just to give you an example, in the context of the GGE, the word benefit has become a dirty word. So there have been hours of debates about whether benefits of autonomy in weapon systems could be mentioned in any report that comes out of the group of governmental experts. Another difficulty is the lack of understanding about what one is talking about when one talks about autonomous weapon systems. So in very practical terms, the question is, are we talking about weapon systems that already exist or something that might emerge in the fairly distant future? I mean, there is broad acceptance that there are existing weapon systems, such as the close-in weapon systems used on many naval vessels, that already operate in some form of autonomous mode. And this has then led to an attempt to distinguish between sort of good autonomy, which is already used, and bad autonomy, which might be used in the future. And the result is the mushrooming of vocabulary that attempts to categorize different systems based on their level or nature of autonomy. So there have been references here as well to in-the-loop or out-of-the-loop systems. Some like to refer to semi-autonomous systems or supervised autonomous systems, and so on and so on. Some have introduced special characteristics to distinguish the problematic autonomy, referring to it as self-initiating systems or systems capable of understanding higher level intent and direction. And some have even talked about self-aware systems in this context of being a problem. So the result is that there's been quite a convoluted and time-consuming debate about definitions. So let me be sort of mildly controversial for a moment and submit to you that many of these debates are ultimately pointless and fruitless. First of all, it doesn't make sense to talk about whether a particular system as a whole is autonomous or not. The question is whether a particular function of the system has some degree of autonomy to it. So a particular military system could have autonomy in some of its functions and not in others. So we can think of a mobile platform, for example, that is capable of autonomous navigation, but has no capability of autonomous targeting. When it comes to cyber capabilities, there are any number of things that could be made autonomous. There could be autonomous detection of particular activities in networks by defensive cyber capabilities. There could be autonomous replication of malware and the autonomous execution of payloads in offensive cyber capabilities. But not all tasks of a particular capability need be autonomous to the same degree. Second, and perhaps conceptually more importantly, autonomy doesn't come in neat categories, as some of the terminology suggests. A system can have more or less autonomy in relation to a particular system. So the sharing of the task between the human and the machine occurs on a certain spectrum, and drawing a line on that spectrum is a relatively arbitrary act. So let me propose for the current discussion a fairly minimalist definition of autonomy, which is to say that autonomy means the ability of a system to perform some task without real-time intervention by a human operator. Now, this type of a definition does disconnect the discussion of AI from the discussion of autonomy, in the sense that to achieve this basic autonomy in some function of a system, we don't really necessarily need artificial intelligence. However, artificial intelligence clearly would enable the creation of autonomy that would meet this minimalist definition. So, to put it very briefly, in this paradigm, artificial intelligence is not autonomy. Artificial intelligence is not a prerequisite for autonomy, but artificial intelligence does facilitate autonomy. So let me now turn to some legal issues as well, as promised. The legal debate around autonomy in military systems has been highly polarized. There have been some who've said that autonomy is a radically new development in military technology. The existing law is utterly incapable of handling the challenges created by that technology. We need new law. Preferably, we need a ban of some kind. The other camp, the other extreme, will say, well, we've had autonomy to a limited degree in existing systems. AI makes that autonomy more sophisticated and extends the use of autonomy, but is not really radically new. So there's really nothing new to see here. Let's move on. And then there's, of course, a range of opinions somewhere there in the middle. Different people and organizations and states identifying different issues in the existing legal framework that need either clarification or change. So let me talk about three sets of issues. International law requires political leaders, military commanders and military operators to make certain evaluative judgments to ensure compliance of military operations with the law. And by evaluative judgments, I mean judgments that are not simply based on facts or law, but that require a balancing or an assessment of the facts in light of norms or values, and something that is seen very difficult to replicate in machines. And here are a couple of examples of that. Under international law, a state can exercise its right to self-defense if it suffers from an armed attack, if an armed attack is launched against it. But whether a use of force against a state amounts to the level of an armed attack is an evaluative judgment. The question of whether the self-defense used, the measures of self-defense used, are proportionate and necessary is an evaluative judgment. The same applies to international humanitarian law. Whether collateral damage caused by a military operation is proportionate to the military advantage to be gained is an evaluative judgment. So autonomy in military platforms has been seen as problematic because those systems couldn't possibly make these kinds of decisions. But they don't necessarily need to do that in order to comply with the law. It is possible to substitute human decision-making or human judgment in some way. One might be that the human actually substitutes her judgment in the conduct of the operation with a particular autonomous system. So if the system faces a situation that it cannot properly deal with, it will basically call home. When it comes to cyber capabilities, that's probably not an option given the speed at which things happen. But then there are other possibilities. It might be possible to set technical criteria and to box the autonomy of a capability so that it will almost inevitably comply with the rules of international law. Again, let's think back to Stuxnet a little bit. Assuming that Stuxnet was used in the context of an armed conflict, some of these evaluative judgments would have to be made. However, Stuxnet was not capable of determining whether the centrifuges that it was attacking, if you will, were military objects. Nor was it capable of considering what the collateral damage was and whether the collateral damage was justifiable in light of the military advantage. Rather, the human designers and operators had made that decision beforehand. They had established that the capability that Stuxnet was designed to attack was in fact a military object, and that there was a limited likelihood of collateral damage arising from that. So it's possible to come up with technical criteria that would satisfy the legal requirements without necessarily the technical capability being able to engage in legal reasoning of its own. Another concern is that autonomous systems are unpredictable. In other words, they can inadvertently operate in ways that the user didn't intend, and that might potentially cause harm that the user in fact wanted to avoid. Some would say that this unpredictability itself makes autonomous systems, when they're weaponized, incompatible with international law. However, nothing is completely predictable. Any complex weapon system has a degree of predictability in it. And a human being, a human combatant, can also act in unpredictable manner. So unpredictability itself is perhaps not something that would cause a system to be unlawful. But it is a question of managing legal and operational risk. Military commanders obviously do not want to use capabilities that operate in an unpredictable manner. They want capabilities that are as predictable as possible. Likewise, if a state decides to adopt a military system that can operate in an unpredictable manner, it will assume the risk for any of the legal consequences that might arise. So it seems that predictability is really more of a question for setting appropriate technical standards than some sort of an absolute red line rule that would prohibit a particular capability from being used. And there are instances of international law rules where whether something was intended or not does not really matter, so that inadvertent and unpredictable actions that have been procured by a state would still trigger certain international responsibility. Think, for example, of the breaches of airspace of a state. We're generally not terribly interested in why a foreign military aircraft breached an airspace, whether that was because the pilot took the aircraft there, whether it was because of a navigational error, whether it was because of some form of autopilot kicking in, and so on and so forth. The objective fact of a foreign aircraft entering an airspace without permission in itself triggers responsibility under international law. And so it's perfectly possible that an autonomous capability, whether kinetic or cyber, will behave in some manner that was perhaps not predicted, but will actually trigger the international responsibility of the state that operates that capability. This in turn, however, does highlight the importance of processes that states have placed for reducing unpredictable consequences and improving predictability. I mentioned technical standards already, but for those of you more legally inclined, there's a requirement under international law to review weapon systems for their compatibility with international law. And I would suggest to you that that type of process will play a significant role in ensuring that autonomy in weapon systems is consistent with international law. And finally, there's been a lot of talk about an accountability gap when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, in particularly a concern about how to divide accountability between the different individuals that are involved in the life cycle of a system that has some autonomous functionality. So when it comes to an autonomous kinetic weapon system, how do we divvy up responsibility between the operator of the system and the people who designed it or gave permission for it to be used in the armed forces? Some of this problem falls away, interestingly, when it comes to cyber capabilities, where the line between the operators and the designers of a system is perhaps not quite as sharp as with kinetic military systems, which can potentially be used or procured as an off-the-shelf capability. What is perhaps a slightly bigger concern is that international criminal law, so the international law regime that tries to give effect to international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, generally only designates as war crimes actions that have been committed with intent. So the question arises that if an autonomous system causes some harm to civilians, for example, inconsistently with international law, but without the intent of any given person, would war crimes charges, for example, be possible? But that also raises the question that whether the negligence of systems designers and programmers is really properly addressed through the law of war crimes and international criminal law, or whether some other accountability mechanisms would be more suited for that purpose. And finally, even leaving aside the disputes about individual criminal responsibility, there's also the responsibility of states. So states ultimately bear responsibility for weapon systems or cyber capabilities that they deploy, including if they have some autonomous functionality in them. Perhaps something that could be done in this space is to extend the idea of a no-fault or strict liability that exists in some other areas of international law. So in space law, perhaps most famously, space objects falling to the ground and causing harm to people are the liability or are the responsibility of the state that launched that space capability, irrespective of whether there was any fault involved in the incident itself. So perhaps the same type of thinking will need to be extended in the future to autonomous capabilities as well. So perhaps this presentation at least sort of illustrates that there are different positions to be taken between the two legal extremes. One saying that autonomy means that we need to throw out the existing legal framework and get a new one, and the other extreme which says that there are no legal problems at all. I think we're somewhere there in the middle, and it's proving to be something of a legal gray zone, and we're not really, as an international community, making a whole lot of progress on that at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have few minutes, maybe 1-2 questions if there are any audience questions. I do have one question. You know, if we take traditional, at least in US view, in the military operations, we can see them in a 3 level. In the tactical level, day or two. On the operational level, which is a longer time frame and larger forces, and on the strategic level. You know, in your point of view, the issues of international law, for example, autonomy, are equally or specifically applied in a different way to these 3 different levels of military operations?
I think international law issues arise in all of those levels, but in a slightly different way and slightly different international law questions. So questions, for example, as to the circumstances under which a state will exercise its right to self-defense by using force are a fairly high-level decision. Whereas on the tactical level, specific targeting decisions will have to be made that involve an assessment of whether something is a legitimate military object or whether the rule of proportionality is being complied with. So slightly different obligations on different levels, but the questions really arise, I think, on all of these levels.
Okay, thank you. You know, our session is almost over, and we can draw at least a couple conclusions. One conclusion is here that people who are developing and thinking about AI systems in military operations are doing that, but there are also other experts, for example, in law, or in socio-cultural autonomy, or in social science. And seems to me that I think it's time that these 2 different or 3 different disciplines should start to talk more, so that we can, you know, anticipate the technical solutions, taking account the legal impact, or design, for example, technical solutions which take account socio-cultural autonomy. For example, if US fought in Afghanistan, there was a very important for the military operations to know the local social, cultural traditions. So I think probably our today's session raised these questions and really is appeal for more stronger and deeper multidisciplinary cooperation. Thank you very much.